Cast your minds back to 2011. You've just powered up your Xbox 360. You're wondering what to play. Not to fear, the hype train is here. BRINK has arrived. That is essentially one of the taglines they used for this game. Now, you may remember the hype at that time. It was promised to be a revolutionary shooter experience. It was developed by Splash Damage and it was published by Bethesda, which, if history is anything to go by, means it was in good hands. Unfortunately, BRINK kind of fell by the wayside, and it is one of the most mundane plain shooters you will probably find on the 360, and that's saying something because there are many of those. It was apparently meant to blur the lines between single player, co-op and multiplayer. It promised so much and it delivered so little. So before its release, BRINK was advertised as a game changer. It features a unique parkour system called SMART. Now, you ready for this? It's called a smooth movement across random terrain. That's what SMART means. So parkour, essentially. It had customizable characters. It was a dystopian storyline set on a floating city known as the Ark. How very original. I feel like I've seen that somewhere before. Gamers were drooling over the trailers, imagining seamless team-based battles where they could leap over obstacles like ninjas while their personalised avatars saved the day. So first impressions, upon firing up BRINK for the first time, you were greeted with an art style that was, in a word, distinctive. I mean, I say that, it wasn't really that distinctive because you can compare it to another game. Facebreaker came out 3 years prior to BRINK, and if you ask me, the faces, the character models all look very, very similar, and you can kind of loosely tie it into FIFA Street 3 as well. That kind of let the series down in my opinion, but still, the character models kind of looked like that, and yet the graphics of the world, they were good and they were realistic to a point, which kind of really made for a very strange art style of the game. I'm not saying it was a bad thing necessarily, but it is one of the points that many people pick up on as to why you should not play this game. And then of course I have seen people say that, hey, I quite like the art style, so it is subjective. Let's talk about the gameplay then. So BRINK's SMART system, basically just parkour, tried to make the movement more fluid and intuitive. In reality, it felt more like you were controlling a slightly tipsy parkour enthusiast. Of course, you could vault over obstacles and slide under barriers, but the system wasn't as responsive as we'd hoped it would be. It often left you wondering whether your character had missed their morning coffee or just skipped out on that sort of SMART system training altogether. It was like you had a rookie who just didn't turn up to orientation. Combat, while featuring an impressive array of weapons and customization options, was hampered by inconsistent AI matchmaking issues. You'd often find yourself either steamrolling over the enemy team or getting obliterated without much of a middle ground, and that led for some very, very frustrated missions, whereas some of them you have to hold down a specific spot for over 10 minutes and you have completely useless AI teammates, so you're left to do the whole thing yourself. And when it's completely unbalanced, you're often up against it, many times throwing the controller across the room in anger, which I remember doing a fair few times. The gunplay, which of course is the main point of a first-person shooter, lacked satisfying punch you'd expect from a high-octane shooter, feeling more like you were firing Nerf guns at overly aggressive mannequins. Now, of course, if that was the tagline for the game, I'm sure no one would have been hyped for it, but they made this game out to be the next big thing in FPS. It had this SMART system. It was meant to have great gunplay, and of course it was a dystopian world and people love that stuff. And yet it just didn't deliver on much of anything. The story in particular. The narrative was there, somewhere, if you squinted hard enough. BRINK offered a campaign for both the resistance and security, but the storylines felt more like a series of loosely connected skirmishes rather than a cohesive plot. In fact, the majority of the cutscenes are just dull and you know full well they were just chucked in last minute for filler. The characters are as deep as a paddling pool, and by the end you weren't sure if you were supposed to feel triumphant or just relieved that it was over. Multiplayer wise, this game was hampered through a series of problems from start to finish. I'm not really sure where the servers are at this moment. I do believe there was some sort of resurgence, much like Shadowrun actually, and Session 8 has been recently. I think they've had sort of revivals on Steam, and I think this is a very similar state. But back in 2011, when the game first came out, matchmaking was an absolute nightmare. It was almost impossible to find a game, and it was P2P based as well, so the connection was there, but finding the connection in the first place was the challenge. In hindsight, BRINK was a game that tried to be everything but ended up being not much of anything at all. Its ambitious ideas were bogged down by technical issues, clunky mechanics, and a lack of polish. It's the gaming equivalent of a McDonald's advert. You see the burger nicely stacked up, the lettuce just sticking out of the side, the cheese beautifully hung over the edge of the burger, turns up and it is an absolute mess. This looks nothing like the picture, and that's exactly what BRINK is. However, BRINK wasn't without its charm. The character customization was way ahead of its time. The art style, in my opinion, isn't that bad at all. I think it has some sort of nostalgic appeal to it. It's a game that reminds us of the importance of execution over ambition. These days, video games can take decades to come out. They promise the world and end up under-delivering, and that's exactly what BRINK has done. This should be a stamp in time for developers to look back on and say, we do not want to be BRINK. We don't want another BRINK. We need to overdevelop and overdeliver and underpromise. Unfortunately, no one's learned from this, so if you ever find yourself with an old Xbox 360 and a copy of BRINK lying around, give it a spin for old time's sake, but if you've got another game on hand, I would probably play that instead. I don't like giving games ratings, especially older ones, because our minds can be a little bit skewed, but I do remember not particularly enjoying this game that much when it first came out, and having revisited it, I'm pretty much of the same opinion. And if you're wondering why I've not had a series video out, it's because he won't let me talk.